Hello and welcome to Taking the Liberties Radio, episode 10, no, 11 for season 6. My name's Lee. I'm in Western Australia. I'm a very tired boy right now.
Not half as tired as me. I just got back from Hong Kong.
Yeah, that's probably true.
From your
Let's,
honeymoon. Congratulations, Vikas.
Thank you.
Again?
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
um, well, you've heard the other two joining us tonight, which is Vikas and Zeev, coming from the East Coast. This week we're going to be talking about some election-related stuff. So we're going to talk about the childcare plan and price controls and subsidies, because we've never had a problem with those things in government policy before. So let's get started with that. Labor has announced... Well, we'll start with gender pay gap, because that one's a bit more nebulous and hard to sort of get
Yeah.
into. So basically, Labor has made a pledge to close the gender pay gap. The details of how they're doing this is very non-specific. And all we really know so far is they're going to increase subsidies to childcare, which we'll get into that. But also they're going to sort of make government agencies and businesses declare their gender pay gaps. Somehow there's this national discussion they're going to lead. Gentlemen, what are your thoughts?
I'm confused because this already exists. There's an organization called the Workplace Equity and Gender Agency, WEGA, which requires organizations over the size of 100 employees, to report their statistics on pay for between each gender. And I think even now they have to divide even more to include what do you call them? LGBT statistics and stuff like that as well. I don't know exactly how they could enforce even more than what they're currently doing, unless they remove that restriction from 100 employees or more to just get rid of all employees. So just say, like, from...
Get it to apply to any business regardless of size. But I don't think they're proposing that, because this is a separate proposal that is dealing with public agencies rather than...
Public
rather
agencies.
than-
Public agencies already have merit boards, and there's a whole other beast involved there with the Australian Public Service Code, and how they do their equity and gender employment policies. And I would say that those public servants, it sounds a lot stupider, but I'd imagine the stuff they're talking about is either beyond what they're talking about already in place in the public service. Like right now in the public service, you will literally have merit boards say if they find two candidates that are perfectly equal, they'll promote the minority ahead of the white man. Like they'll say that quite openly, and they'll say, like, that's a meritocratic process. Go
on.
Yeah. So I mean, in terms of what they're currently proposing, it's so nebulous it could mean anything. But I actually would like to see details on this, because I'm sitting here going, like, I live in Canberra. This is like we have to deal with this when we apply for work here in Canberra.
Yeah.
Or if you're starting a business in Canberra. And I'd be really surprised to see that they're suggesting anything that's not already in place.
So I actually just discovered, because we were discussing this beforehand, the reason we brought this up is because there's like a graphic that Labor is circulating saying how it says they'll lead a national push to close the gender pay gap, and there wasn't a link to a policy. If you click on the actual image, it has in the comment section their policy. So this is what they are saying they're going to do. They're going to change the Fair Work Act to make it clear that the Fair Work Commission must consider pay equity a central objective of the workplace relations system. They've got...
essentially meaningless, because it already does that.
Sure, yep. Fully fund professional pay increases of 20% to early childhood... early childhood... God, Englishing today. Early childhood educators. Pay rises, they've restored cuts to penalty rates, bans pay secrecy clauses, and give employees the right to disclose. So there's a few things that's around workplace relations. I'll put the link for you guys, and I'll put the link in the show notes as well.
That last point, make it outlaw workplace secrecy agreements. I was pretty sure we instituted the Fair Work Act that they did that. So for anyone who's not familiar with this, workplace secrecy agreement is something that came into place. I don't know exactly how successful they were, but it was something that came into place when Howard scrapped the old industrial relations system. And basically what it was people on individual contracts were told that they couldn't discuss what their salary was on punishment of like not getting future pay rises and stuff like that.
Yeah.
I was pretty sure when they brought in Fair Work Australia in 2007 that was illegal. That kind of clause was made illegal. I'm pretty sure, but we'd have to consult an actual workplace employer.
Yeah.
Workplace lawyer, if that's the case. I have personally never seen that clause, and I'm a contractor. I have to I negotiate my contracts for bread and butter. I have never seen that. I'd be very surprised if that's a thing. But if it is a thing, I'm happy to be corrected.
Yeah, I mean,
I think the main point of this policy announcement. I mean, we're honing in on the details, and that's it's worth doing. But I think the main point of this policy announcement is not to really implement any kind of substantive change. It is simply to tell the public that they are concerned, that Labor is concerned about pay equity in the abstract. It doesn't really matter whether any of this will achieve any kind of tangible objective. And in fact, it's not, none of these policies have promised to achieve any kind of tangible objective.
Yeah.
It's just closing the gender pay gap, whatever that means, however that's defined. However that will happen, no one really knows. It's just, a bunch of, appoint some bureaucrats and change some laws and, magic, snap your fingers, it will happen.
So it's kind of like how when Hawke got up in the 1980s and said there will be no child living in poverty in Australia by what was it, the year 2000 or something
2000,
like that.
I think. Yeah.
Yeah. So I understand that Labor is prone to make these grandiose light on the hill speeches, I believe they're called. They always hark back to Chiefly and how he used to talk about the light on the hill and like some kind of promise of like a better Australia for everyone. So I understand that they're kind of hearkening to that tradition. But to be perfectly honest, this is one of those policies that I think it's like, okay, everybody's on board with pay equity. Everybody's on board with, in general, like, hey, two people should be paid the same if they're doing the same work. Now, the reality is, in the real world, two people, even if they have exactly the same job title, are not doing the same job.
Yeah.
And the reason for that is those two people are working at different efficiency rates. Each one is doing not just different efficiency rates, but each one will have their own style. There's no such thing as an aggregate supply, a unit of supply of labor.
Yeah. So it's not, humans are not widgets. They're not individual. You cannot just sort of substitute one person for another and get the exact same output. You're always going to have variation. It also
correct.
Like the reason,
and
for
also,
So I don't. Yeah. Really, the gender pay gap is a feature of statistical analysis. It's not necessarily. It's how you organize the numbers of how much women get paid in the workplace as opposed to men. And I think it's fee or definitely. The Learn Liberty. I'll put a video in the show notes for Learn Liberty, which discusses this, which essentially says, at least in the US, that the gender pay gap is almost overwhelmingly explained by the choices that women make around work. Which, granted, like, you can have cultural issues where women are expected to be stay-at-home mums, which then affects their pay and their work opportunities. But that's a separate question, and none of what is being discussed here will necessarily get to that. I read a New York Times article today that talked about, how it makes more sense for very high earners, for the husband to work crazy 80-hour weeks or 60-hour weeks and get paid a lot, and then have the wife stay at home to look after the children, because they would make more money than if she worked more hours and he worked less hours. Because in the kinds of like law and business consultancy, like people are rewarded for working crazy long hours and being on call all the time. So none of this would deal with that situation. It's just about, like the statistical analysis that arrives at the 17% gender pay gap would still be there. In fact, it might even get worse, because if you make workplaces more inflexible in general, then it's going to impact people who want flexibility and more regulation.
It's women that... I was going to say, if you take a look at it, every time they've instituted these policies, it's as you stated, flexibility is what goes. And the funny thing is, flexibility is the highest rating factor for women when it comes to workplace choices.
Yeah, correct.
And that's been done countless times. Women, no matter every society that they work in, right? Women favor flexibility above everything else.
Yeah.
And if you take away the flexibility in the way that the union movement does, you end up basically impacting women in quite a negative way. Now, one thing, this is a bit of a bugbear of mine. I keep hearing, feminized industry, right? Like, the childcare is a feminized industry. Nursing is a feminized industry, right? And I sit there going like, so you're saying that it's majority women doing that job, right? Okay, sure. And then they're saying, well, the reason why those industries are paid less is because it's women mostly doing the work. And I kind of sit there and go like, I don't, because it's not true, because there are majority male industries which are also low paid, right? And obviously the quintessential example is basically what do you call them, like logistics people, the loggies, the people who are like carting large amounts of
truck drivers, that kind of thing.
Not truck drivers. Truck drivers actually make quite a lot of money. It's the forklift operators and stuff like that. That's what I'm talking. The stevedorian sort of thing. And until those guys were unionized, they were really poorly paid. So I kind of sit there and go like, I don't think it's because it's a feminization issue. I think it's because they tend to be low skill jobs, right?
Sure.
And until the union movement comes in and institutes a shit ton of what do you call it? Workplace licensing and a whole bunch of enterprise bargaining and a whole bunch of things to stop undercutting of labor costs. It's not until all of that happens that those industries tend to rise up in prices. I get, like I said, it's a bugbear of mine, because the real thing that seems to drag the price of labor down is the amount of skill, right, that goes into it.
Yeah.
Right.
And particularly, I mean, if in the case of something like law or medicine, which I think from my understanding of the stats is, if it's correct, there's more women going to college, at least in the US, than men. So, in a lot of these industries like law and medicine and whatnot, there are more women than ever. But it still, I think, comes down to the issues of the choices that people make. And I think it's worth saying that, you can have a bad culture or have bad expectations, or, expectations that are detrimental to women's ability to make their choices. So, like, I don't know if it's a good thing for women to sort of be pressured to be stay-at-home mums. I mean, that's a separate question, and that's much bigger, and the government can't fix that.
I think that
it's still worth acknowledging that you still, like, there could still be no gender pay gap and still be injustice in terms of how women are treated in workplaces, or the expectations that the culture has around women in work.
That's true. What I would add is that, I mean, we should expect there to be some gender pay gap, because when we talk about people doing the same work, they may not necessarily have the same experience level. And that means that they may be doing the same work, but one person may be doing it faster than another person because one person is more experienced. So one thing that people face across society is that women tend to have children and therefore have less experience because they're out of the workforce for a period of anywhere from half a year to a year or sometimes more. And as a result, they're held back in their careers. Now, that's the choice that they've made to have kids, and that's a factor that is going to be one that impacts on their ability to command the same pay compared to another employee. Now, on top of that, they'll be engaging in childcare. I mean, so will their husbands or partners or what have you, but at least statistically across society, women tend to do more of that and men tend to do less. So while I'm not saying it's a good or a bad thing in itself, I think that's to some extent always going to be there. There's no way that it can really go away. Women are always going to have to take time off work after having kids because just physically it takes a toll. Childbirth is a very physically, difficult thing for a woman to undergo.
Maybe not. Look, I've seen.
Sorry, did you say maybe not that childbirth is a difficult thing to undergo?
No, maybe not that they need to take a significant amount of time off. Yeah, no. Childbirth is.
Oh, look, some people can hire wet nurses and all of that. I guess if that's what you mean, Vikas.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. I've literally seen directors at companies that I've worked who've come back literally the day after they've given birth and just been back on the phone calls straight at 10 a.m. Yeah. So, I mean,
look, in some cultures that will happen. So you're quite right, because in some cultures, there's, you have the means and ability to hire a wet nurse to breastfeed your child, and therefore you're back to work the next day. And that is not really something that is possible in Australia because, we don't have a sufficient population size or pay rates sufficiently low to make that viable.
I found it interesting that we had to talk about the wet nurse a few times. I know. I'm just thinking, like, what does the wet nurse have to do with this? Anyway, no.
Isn't that the expression?
I don't know.
Occupation.
I don't know. I don't know, but I take your point. There is this is a director of a company, so I imagine that plays into it. But look, I'm of the opinion that that the childbirth angle. I sit there and go, like, childbirth is technically 6 months out of a woman's life. I don't think it should impact as much as people say it should. I think the amount of impact is probably grossly exaggerated. I think they might miss out on one promotion opportunity, but I think in the grand scheme of things, I don't know if anyone's done any research on this.
I think it's that plus the cultural preference for flexible work that follows it. But again, it's a cultural preference. It doesn't necessarily mean it's inevitable.
I would say the latter probably impacts more on why women don't go above a certain level than men. Because look, it's not even the majority of men that go into these management and like high level positions, right? It's a very small select group, a select group of people who are singularly focused on a specific set of skills that basically revolve around trying to make as much money, generate as much sales as possible for an organization. Or if it's in politics, someone who has the connections to move the bureaucracy to actually get shit done for people who are wanting a piece of that power pie. So I don't think as the second thing. I think it's the flexibility. I think if you want more flexibility, you'll find your options as you go further up that chain decrease a lot. And women who've gone up to those top levels, like Ida Buttrose, Ida Buttrose is just the one that's ringing bells to me because she's the one who said you got to be willing to give up things, right, in order to be in those positions.
Sure.
So I've always maintained that it's the second thing, that it's the women's desire. It's the women's preference for more flexibility that's really held them back from these higher level positions of power. And it's the same reason why most of us, like, I'm not a director. Lee's not a director.
No.
I enjoy keeping my hours to a solid, between 38 and 43 hours a week. So I like to keep it reasonable. I mean, I will do a 60 to 80 hour week if it's required of me for like a project, but I'm not going to do it day in, day out for the rest of the year. I like my spare time. I like doing things like this. I like playing games. I like hanging out with my wife. So yeah.
Well, let's move on to the second topic, which is kind of related, because I guess the argument Labor might put up, or people who support Labor's policy, which is to heavily subsidize childcare, would be that, well, if we can free people up from having to bear the burden of raising children, maybe they would go into the workplace. Which, I mean, there's
why don't we just bring on the Brave New World? Why doesn't the state just take care of our kids right from the get-go, right? Like we just subsector them into, based on a simple IQ test right at the beginning, into alphas, betas, gammas, deltas, and then just kind of sort out society. Like, straight off the bat in the first 5 years, you can figure out, okay, this kid's going to be a lawyer, this kid's going to be an engineer, this kid's going to be this thing, right? And we can sort it all out at the beginning, right? And then, future generations will just, have a nice structured class society with perfect little bureaucrats.
Well, I mean, that's one way of putting it. I don't think Labor would personally put it that way. But so for the specifics of the policy, essentially they're going to increase the subsidy to basically for a lot of families all the way up to the full cost of childcare. And even for sort of higher earning income, so people up to $170,000 a year, there is some increase to the amount of money that the government will subsidise the cost of childcare. But the flip side is now they're going to start. Well, they've talked about potentially having price controls and, like setting a certain amount of which they will cover. So,
you're going to need to if you're subsidising for 370,000 more people. Okay, so now presumably that means at least 370,000 more kids in the system.
Yeah.
Or if that maybe it doesn't mean 370,000 more kids in the system, but it means the existing 370,000 are there, plus the additional second kid that they weren't sending before. So I can't see anything good coming out of this other than, hey, you're going to have a shortage to begin with. Yeah. And I think... So the first thing you're going to see is a shortage. So the next thing they've said is they want to do a price control.
Yeah, so they're talking about where was it? I think there's essentially it's a certain level, essentially a cap on the amount that they will subsidize. So like, essentially, if you go to some super fancy rich childcare agency, I guess they won't cover all of that.
So they only cover. So let's say they only cover like $50 an hour or something.
Yeah,
that's great.
Hold on. No, we have the figures here, gentlemen. The current cap is $11.77 per hour for long day care, what Labor is saying is that they will. The cap itself will not change, but what they will do is that they will increase payments of that under that cap. So that households
people are covered.
Yeah, exactly. So that households between $70,000 to $100,000 will earn 85% to 100% of the cap, and those earning above that, between $100,000 to $175,000, would be receiving 60% to 80% of the cap. Cool. And to be eligible for the subsidy, households will need to meet an activity test, which means that the parent, this is still the case today, the parent must either be working, looking for work, volunteering, doing unpaid work in a family business, studying, training, or self-employed. So, in other words, they're in.
Did he go quiet for you too?
Yes.
Okay, so based on what he just said, I'm going to go with, okay, cool. So the price goes up by $11.27.
Yeah. Done. Yeah, I mean it's one of those things where I think you might be back with us. This deals with the symptom, not the cause. So the question is not, do families have enough money to cover the cost of childcare? The question is, why is childcare so expensive? And when you look at really what both both Labor and Coalition have done is essentially increase the cost of childcare by forcing providers to hire people with higher levels of qualifications and putting in all these rules and regulations and just making it more expensive to do this, which of course drives.
You now need a master's degree. You now need a master's degree to open a childcare centre.
Yeah,
so that gives you an idea of how difficult it is.
Yeah.
And on top of that, you need planning approval.
You're kidding me. Oh, wow. There's local law. Wow. Okay, cool. Okay, so there's a combination of zoning laws, occupational licensing, and government price controls. Cool. So here's what we can talk about.
Perfect for like low cost, effective, efficient delivery service, right, guys? Come on.
Yeah, I'm just like, that's
negativity.
That's
never had a
never
problem with
gonna.
planning or like any of that shit.
So there are basically, in a nutshell, what that means is that it is very expensive to open, or very difficult to open a childcare centre, simply because you need to study for a few years before you can open one. And then on top of that, you can't just open it anywhere. You need to open it in a place where the local council allows you to open it, which may not be the best place. And on top of that, you need to ensure that you hire enough staff to meet the government's staffing ratios. And then on top of that, those staff need to be staff that have undertaken a TAFE course to do it.
Yeah.
And that takes several months and money to do that. So what all of that means is that there are fewer workers, there are fewer providers, and therefore there's a surge of higher prices because supply has gone down. And then
on top of that, your subsidy is pushing the price up.
Yes. Yes, because your subsidies are increasing demand, so that means that prices are going up.
Yep.
So, and it's also, at one point, it was also increasing fraud because the subsidies were being paid direct to the childcare centres. And of course, it was very easy for the childcare centres to say, we've got 100, to invent children, exactly. And people were being caught out on this well after the fact and jailed. But the fact is that if people were being caught out well after the fact, there are probably plenty of people who hadn't been caught out well after the fact.
Yep.
That's the marvels of our current childcare system. And at the end of the day, what needs to be driven home is that, babysitters do this without any qualifications at all.
Yep.
I'm not suggesting that wants or needs. For now. Yeah, but I'm not suggesting that everyone wants just a simple babysitter. Maybe they want someone who's a bit more educated to, deal with their kids. But in principle, at least, there's nothing to my mind that's wrong about, a few babysitters setting up shop and dealing with 20 kids or whatever number.
I think it's one of those things where, like,
formal qualifications.
It's a combination of, I think that's probably safety. Under the guise of safety, they increase the ratios, but also the nature of looking after kids, at least from the government's perspective, has changed. Where I think the reason you need a master's degree is because this is seen as early education rather than just seen as like literally keeping the kids, like monitoring them while their parents go do something else. So where the babysitter has no requirement to be educated because the babysitter is just making sure they don't burn their house down. Where I suspect if you talk to the various ministers who are involved in all this, administering these programs, they would say, "Oh no, but we need to educate our children during daycare. It needs to be a substantive program rather than."
But the difficulty
what really would happen is if you had a free market in these things, is you'd have old nanas who are like, "Yeah, I'll have 5 kids in my house, and you can pay me X amount of dollars a day," and they just like put them in front of the TV, which I'm fine with. But
some people might.
Others, and plenty of parents might be willing to pay more. So that's the thing. Parents might be willing to pay more for a better service. What these things do, all of these schemes, is it basically cuts out the very cheapest forms of care, which people will also choose voluntarily.
Basically means that there are fewer women. It basically means that there are fewer women in the workforce as a result, because it means that by driving up the cost of care, and which is what these regulations do, it means that fewer people can afford to pay for care, which means it's no longer economical for them to be in the workforce. That it would be cheaper for them to care for their children, and that will invariably, it does come down on working women who choose not to work anymore as a result.
And also,
that's
just
the
before we jump
reality.
in, because just want to add to that point, it also cuts down the opportunities for women who maybe don't have skills in other forms of work, but can look after children, because it's, they know how to do that because they've got their own. If you're a low-skilled woman, you could look after children in your home or in ways that work for you and charge a nominal rate because you already look after your own. But that's all wiped out.
And then you grow a business in that way and accrue skills as a business owner, and who knows what that could emerge into.
Yeah. So we'll go to Vikas, and then we'll wrap things up because we've got to run out of time.
So what I was going to say is this is also, I think people forget the elitist angle in this as well, right? Like all of this stuff is like actually increasing the cost of childcare for the common man, right? But you think like those cheaper forms of childcare don't exist for the wealthy and connected? I mean, what do you call it? Richard Di Natale had au pairs, right? Right.
That's true.
Yeah, Peter Dutton got au pairs for a bunch of his mates. So the well-connected, right? The well-connected and the well-to-do are able to get foreign migrant labor on the cheap because of their contacts in the with immigration ministers or with members of parliament who can ask the immigration minister for a favor. So, I mean, this is really just stuff to screw over the common person.
Yeah.
It doesn't affect the wealthy.
That's true.
Wealthy have access to cheap childcare.
All right. Well, maybe we'll leave it at that because I think that's a good point to leave it on. So thanks everybody for joining us. We'll be back again next week with more discussion of stuff from a libertarian perspective.
And maybe we might actually attack the Liberals' policies.
Well, if they actually need to have something of enough substance to actually attack. So when they do that, we'll have a go at them.
You mean they've been going into this election without policies? You don't say.
I know it's hard to believe.
The Liberal Party going into an election without policies. That's never happened before.
Never. All right. Thanks, everybody.
See ya.